This is BNN Bloomberg 1410, and it's time for The Law Show with Jim Gordon, Vancouver's only law-focused radio show, offering a comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Joining us this week, Murphy Battista, LLP, Vancouver Personal Injury Lawyers. Now, here's your host, Jim Gordon.
Thank you very much. It is The Law Show. Jim Gordon here, as mentioned. Joining me, as always, is Joe Murphy. Joe, good to see you again.
Hello, Jim.
Joe, for listeners out there that may have not heard the show before, we want to do a little recap. Let's, as we always do, start out with a little discussion about you, your career, and the company Murphy Battista.
Jim, the firm was established January 1982, and if anyone was alive back then, they'll remember that we had 18 and 19% interest rates, and it was a bit of a bloodbath. The real estate market was collapsing. Businesses were closing. Alberta was in a real funk because of the then National Energy Program. So businesses everywhere were closing, and we were the exception. We opened. Joe Battista and I and two secretaries. That was the firm then. Since then, we've grown. We're now 4 offices. We have 26 lawyers and I think about 75 support staff.
We should say those 4 offices, Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. Can you talk a little bit about personal injury lawyers and personal injury victims? Let's talk about the work that you guys do, and we'll kind of unpack it all in the various areas.
Personal injury lawyers deal with injury claims, mostly car accident claims. The public knows personal injury lawyers from those firms that advertise a lot on TV. Ironically, the 2 firms that do the most advertising are not BC firms. They're Ontario firms.
I was going to say, Joe, just sorry to interrupt you, but one of the things that struck me when we first met doing the show is that people misunderstand that point that you just brought up. I see the kindly, old, wise gentleman that's leading a group of people on television on those commercials that air all the time and assume, I'll get to talk to that guy because he's probably just down the street from where I live.
Yeah, that guy's the marketing manager. He's not a lawyer.
Right.
He's very good in the role as in that commercial
Central
because everyone
fabulous.
thinks, boy, this is like Father Knows Best. Yeah. This is the guy I want to talk to. These are 2 firms that moved in from Ontario a few years ago. They advertise and give the impression as if they've been here forever and they're here to take care of the people of BC. I always say to people, if you were looking to find a really good neurosurgeon, would you look at the TV ads or the newspaper ads?
Good point.
Or would you go to your family doctor and say, can you tell me someone who's good at this that I can go and talk to? So I've always thought the better the firm, the less the advertising they need to do. And our firm has done very little advertising. In the days when the big advertising was Yellow Page ads, we weren't in the Yellow Pages. We get work referred to us. We get people who get advice and are told, go and talk to these people because they know what they're doing and they've got a great track record.
Because you've also mentioned in the past that majority of your work is referral, yes?
Yes.
Very nice.
Yes.
And also the other point that you brought up before about the fact that you don't know what quality of representation you will get if you're going in to see some of these firms that advertise on television. You could say, oh, yep, that guy, but you're not going to get him. You could get somebody out here that's a junior lawyer kind of thing. Is it fairly accurate?
Well, that's one of the problems. The other problem is this. People who are injured in accidents almost invariably say, I don't want to go to trial. Because trial's a huge loss of privacy and there's stresses and all that. But what those people should realize is unless they hire a lawyer who's with a firm that goes to trial a lot, that their case is going to be settled for less than it should be because the insurance company knows which lawyers go to court and which don't.
Very true.
So it's like hiring a gunslinger thinking you've hired this top-notch gunslinger, but the other side knows he's just got blanks.
Nice.
He doesn't have real bullets because it's not going to go to a final showdown in a courtroom.
You talk in the past about personal injury, and it's not, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just about car accidents. Some of the stats that you've thrown out in the past about in that category of the percentage of chance of pedestrian being injured is skyrocketed in the last 20 years, just in the Vancouver Lower Mainland.
Well, it has because the drivers are distracted.
Yeah.
People are going faster.
And what's the thing that's distracting that you always rail against?
Cell phones. But even people who are, maybe they're even on a phone and they've got wireless phones, but they get so involved. But cell phones are a huge distraction. And you just have to get on an elevator, get on a bus, get in any group, and you get these people who are on their phone almost all the time. Well, when those people get behind the wheel, there's that same seduction to pick up their phone. They don't want to be left out. They don't want to miss anything, even if it's just for a 10-minute drive. So that's a huge problem. The reality is when people who are distracted as drivers cause accidents, they rarely, if ever, say, I was on my phone. Yeah. It's, well, I didn't see him, or he cut in front of me. The spotted dog ran across the road, this kind of stuff. So, but it's a real problem, and until the government cracks down and until industry finds a way that you can disable someone's cell phone while they're driving a car, it's going to continue to be a problem, and it's resulted in an explosion of accidents and an explosion of claims. Distracted drivers kill more people than drunk drivers in BC today. You told me a point a while back that if you look at the landscape of people causing accidents by phones versus, say, 25, 30 years ago where it was like drunk driving, it's massively different because so many more people are on their phone. I don't want to minimize drink driving, but that how many people out of 20 are doing that in the middle of the morning as opposed to be on their phone? No, it's true. And this is not a problem that's replaced the drunk driving problem. Yeah. This is in addition to the drunk driving problem. Fortunately, drunk driving has become far less of a problem in the last 15, 20 years because people are simply more aware of you just don't get drunk and drive. Yeah. It still happens, but and you can tell over Christmas when the police catch 10 drunk drivers, whereas years ago they might have caught 75. Yeah. So people are more aware of that, and that's good. People are willing to either not drive when they've been drinking or they get a designated driver. So that's good news, but the cell phone epidemic is creating a huge problem with ICBC, and that's in part why the government's saying we've got a terrible problem here. The difficulty is instead of pointing at the distracted drivers, the problem, they point at the people injured by these drivers, some of whom are distracted, and they say, you're the problem. You've been injured and you're the problem, and we're going to deal with you by reducing the amount of compensation you're entitled to by a little bit or by a huge amount. Yeah, we addressed that last time, and we'll get into that a little later in the show because you talked about that eloquently about the blaming of the victim as opposed to the person driving. I'm in a cab the other day. I'm looking over to my right, and I see a woman with 2 kids in the back, and she's on her phone. She's got the phone in her hand, and she looks over at me, and I'm not trying to be self-righteous and disapproving, but I just kind of looked at it, and she's just slowly put the phone down. But you got 2 kids in the back seat. They're strapped in, yes, but not good. One of the statements I wanted to bring out, well, let's discuss this a bit. Personal injury is not just about car accidents. You have talked quite often on our discussions on this show about the number of other types of accidents and most importantly, why someone may need a personal injury lawyer. I can speak from personal experience, luckily only once, but a person in your category was imperative to me getting through a very difficult time because it's like you're just being overwhelmed by the more serious the injury, the more overwhelmed the person and the family are. We do a lot of brain injury cases. I started doing brain injury cases in the early 1980s. And you're always learning more about brain injuries. And the reality is they devastate the person who's injured and the family. And when I have a new brain injured client come in, I always have them bring in family members or friends because I can tell from the friend's reaction. I'll quite often say to this person, well, how are you doing? They say, oh, I'm doing fine.
Great, yeah.
And you look at the family and they're sort of wincing, thinking, he's not doing fine, she's not doing fine. The irony with a brain injury is often the person with a brain injury recognizes little or nothing about how they've been affected. But the family will often say, this is a different person. And
Joe, has the attitude in the medical community and the legal community changed over the last 3-4 decades in terms of addressing brain injuries?
Jim, yes, very much so. And I think most of the credit has to go to hockey players. Because people, at least in Canada, where we're so addicted to hockey, except right now we don't have a team in the playoffs.
It was about 6 months ago we last played.
Life goes on. But people recognize that you can get someone who's driven into the boards. It doesn't appear to be a big deal, but they're out for weeks or months or maybe forever with a brain injury. People know that a hockey player with a series of concussions may have a fairly modest injury, modest concussion, but that ends their career. So there's a huge learning curve. So it's almost accepted now that if you have a concussion, you're going to have some problems flowing from that. Whereas before, the insurance company used to say, oh, there's no concussion. They're just depressed or they're just anxious.
Yeah, I don't hear the phrase got his bell rung much anymore.
Yeah. Well, you look at the sports industries, the CFL that refuses to recognize that concussions do anything or even exist.
Yeah.
The NFL that says, well, yeah, it's a problem, but we're still working on it, even though there's huge medical research done that repeated concussions cause horrible brain injuries that are progressive in terms of their effect on people.
Because you've had examples of long-term where you're just kind of waiting. I mean, that's an injury. A broken leg is a broken leg, and I've got injuries that I still feel today from 15 years ago. But when it gets to the brain, that's something as you need a lawyer who knows his way around that arena, because you've had clients before that's taken years, right?
The longest one I had was 18 years, and that was a 2 or 3-year-old girl who suffered a brain injury in a car accident. Tragically, her mother was killed in the accident. So not only do you have the brain injured child, you have no mother in the picture. The father was badly hurt. So it was a real awful situation. But it wasn't until she finished high school and started working that I came to understand just how the brain injury impacted her. She'd been on the honor roll throughout school, really bright kid, very hardworking. And when she got out of high school, we determined, trial and error, that the best job she could do was a cleaning lady, provided she went to the same houses every week and there wasn't anything changing. Very bright, but very impaired at the same time.
We're talking with Joe Murphy of Murphy & Battista. It's The Law Show. We've got lots more to talk about, including, you get into springtime, Joe, and we're going to get to this after the break. We see a lot more motorcycle accidents as the weather gets warmer.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll talk about that and a lot more coming up right here on The Law Show. More information on Joe and his company. It's murphybatista.com. 4 offices, including Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. We will be back right after this. It's The Law Show on BNN Bloomberg 1410.
You're on BNN Bloomberg 1410, and we're back with The Law Show with Jim Gordon.
Thank you very much. It is The Law Show. Jim Gordon here with, as always, Joe Murphy of Murphy Battista. And we were talking about accidents, personal injury lawyers, personal injuries. And, Joe, before we move on to our next subject, I wanted to mention that a lot of people associate what you do as strictly like car accidents. But you take a look at your website at murphybatista.com, and a lot of stuff happens to people that have nothing to do with cars. And I cite, and I'm not making light of this by any means, but like dog bites, of course, boating accidents, snowmobile accidents. I personally had a horrible ATV accident years ago that wasn't my fault. Someone hit me, but you guys look after a lot of things. Are people reluctant sometimes for some of these injuries? Because, and I'm not making light of it again by any means, but dog bite, do I contact a lawyer for that? Is it embarrassing? How are you finding people in those categories?
Well, Jim, I think people are reluctant to call a lawyer unless they know them.
Really?
There's that basic fear. Sometimes people don't realize that there is a potential claim. If a child in school goes on a school trip, the parent signs the consent. And if they get hurt on the trip, the parent thinks, well, I signed the consent, nothing we can do. That consent is invalid. But it's permission to take the child, but it doesn't go beyond that.
Because you told a story a while back that just shook me about a school trip. How many times the parents, especially their teenagers going on a trip, you talked about that whitewater rafting trip where the parents signed off, but it also puts these supervisors, these teachers, in an extremely difficult situation.
Have any experience supervising that kind of activity.
What's your advice to parents like that? As you said, you're signing the consent, but that doesn't cover anything. What do you say to a parent? And you can't avoid accidents all the time.
The only thing a parent can do is say to the school, tell me what all is going to happen on this trip.
Right.
I had a case involving a kid in a high school trip to Whistler ski trip who broke his neck. He was quadriplegic. Mm-hmm. And he was a really good kid, very obedient, very athletic. And he broke his neck trying to do flips in the terrain park on Blackcomb. And he wasn't qualified to do flips. But the instructions from the school was, we'll just stay together.
Yeah.
And don't miss the bus at 4 o'clock.
Because you've talked about that, about just kind of clumping everybody together like that.
Had the parents been told we're going to send them into the terrain park, and they often try to do flips, the father would have said, listen, kid, you're not doing the flips, so you're not going. But it's the parents that need that information. The other thing I can tell you about school trips is whenever there's water involved, the danger level goes way up. Swimming. I had a case involving a Asian high school student attending a boarding school, and the kids stayed there in the summer rather than go home. So the school takes them out to one of the lakes up by Whistler, and the kid drowns. Most kids from Asia don't know how to swim.
Really?
They don't take swim lessons. Okay. This was a lake that had a gradual drop-off, and then it dropped way off. Yeah. So you get a kid who's out there, and he can feel the bottom of the lake, and then suddenly takes one step, and he's gone. Yeah. Those kids, if they can't safely do an activity, should have never been taken there. But you looked at it and thought, oh, how in the world did they ever take this group of kids, the great majority of whom didn't swim, to a lake? And trying to supervise kids in a lake is a real challenge. In a pool's challenging, but a lake it's even more because they spread out. So, there's just so many ways on a school trip that kids can get hurt, but the parents need to know what all's involved, and then they can maybe give advice to their kids, maybe say to the teachers, well, who's taking care of this? I told you, I think, on another show about a girl who was injured on a 3-day camping trip. Yeah. She was, I think, about 14. They were climbing in a very steep terrain, and the climber above her dislodged a rock that bounced down and hit her in the head. They came in to see me, and I talked to someone who is an expert on hiking, and they say when you're in an area like that, they go up the hill one at a time. Yeah. So that there isn't a risk that a boulder's knocked out and it falls down onto the climber below you. So I didn't know that, but they should have. Yeah.
So I guess it's really, from you, Joe, just to be very diligent as parents. I mean, I know there's criticism nonstop these days about parents being helicopter parents, and bulldozer parents is the other phrase now, but at the same time, you really need to know what your kid is getting into. That one comment you made earlier about clumping everybody together at various levels of physical ability is something you just take for granted, that, my kid's going with the group, everything will be fine.
Yeah, you think the group is going to provide safety, but if you get teenage boys together, they're going to compete to see who can do the biggest flip or the biggest whatever. Yeah. That's just the nature of the beast.
We're talking with Joe Murphy Battista. 4 locations, Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon, murphybattista.com. Joe, we were talking about this before we started today. Of course, with the warmer weather finally joining us here in Vancouver, we're starting to see a lot more bikes on the road and motorcycles on the road. Murphy Battista also helps cyclists in personal injury claims. And I see people around the city. I know we have more and more bike lanes, which is great, depending. We're not here to discuss the merits of that, but it's amazing how many people are injured in cyclist accidents in this city.
Well, there are, and I don't know whether the rate of accidents has gone up or we just have more people riding bikes.
Probably a good point, yeah.
You also have some motorists, particularly new drivers, that have no concept of having to watch out for a cyclist. If you're driving down the road and there's a bike lane on your right, you've got to be aware that if there is someone in that bike lane, either beside you, in front of you, or more importantly, behind you. Right. And, you get cyclists that watch for drivers that may not see them. Right turns on red lights, people don't look for cyclists. And some intersections that are used by cyclists a lot have signs up that don't allow you to make a right turn on a red, but some people don't see the sign. So, yeah, it's a problem. You also get people that go out in the bush with bikes. Right. And you have to be a real expert biker to go out in the bush on a bike and be safe. We've had a number of cases out of Whistler where kids have gone into bike camps where the parents think they're being taught how to ride properly, and they get badly hurt because they're doing things that kids with that experience level shouldn't even be trying.
Yeah. A friend of mine with 3 kids passed away a couple summers ago. 3 kids up at Whistler, and he flipped over.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, you're right. And it's just, I know he's a great guy, but I know his attitude going in there was just spending time with his boys. Great father. But stuff like that happens unprepared. Have you seen an increase, Joe, in the last couple of years of cyclists seeking help? As you said, there's just that many more people cycling than, say, 10 years ago.
The cycling community is pretty tight.
Yeah.
So, and my sense is the community recognizes that sometimes if people get hurt, they should go and talk to a lawyer. The lawyer may say there's no claim here. The lawyer may say handle it yourself. But there seems to be a willingness to at least talk to someone and find out what their options or choices are.
You've talked to me before about, of course, wearing a helmet is paramount in importance. But when you compare, say, the helmets that I see most cyclists wearing around town compared to what I see a motorcyclist riding, the helmets really aren't terribly protective to the cyclists, are they?
Yeah, yes, they are. Well, they're better than nothing.
Better than nothing, of course.
And they're designed to try and prevent your head from hitting the road, but because they just sit on top of your head, as opposed to a full-face motorcycle helmet that wraps your head, they don't provide you with great protection. So it's better than nothing, but it's still limited. And again, you've got your entire lower head, and especially your lower face, that's exposed when you're wearing a bike helmet.
What type of protection do people have? I live downtown where I see thousands of people going into bike shops, tourists obviously wanting to go see the city in a really healthy way like that, exercise at the same time. What type of protection do people have in that situation?
Well, if you're struck by an automobile, then you're entitled to access, or if you have a collision with an automobile, or if you swerve to avoid a collision with an automobile. If there's a car involved in the accident, then you're entitled to the ICBC medical and rehab benefits, and you're entitled to sue the owner of a car responsible, and there doesn't need to be a collision. Often cyclists will swerve to avoid a collision.
Right.
The problem is, unless the motorist stops and stays, it's a bit of a challenge to try and find out who did this. ICBC has coverage for unidentified drivers, but they have rules about what you have to do to try and locate that driver. And
do you ever have any, you may not have this happen in your situation, your firm, but do you have people come in sometime, because our city is so packed with tourists, especially between, say, May and October, what happens to that tourist from, I don't know, Atlanta or Beijing or something that's in town and has something like this happen? Do you recommend to people like that to see someone here locally like you?
Oh, they have to. The claim is here.
Okay.
There's two kinds of clients I have like that. I have clients who live in BC and are injured somewhere else. And I had 2 girls injured in a bus crash in a tunnel in Paris.
Okay.
And everyone thought whether it was the tunnel that Princess Di died in.
Yeah.
I don't think it was. And then you have people from far away who are injured in BC. And I had a client, a woman from Perth, Australia, which is the most remote big city in the world.
Sure.
And she was here with her family on a holiday and got terribly injured when the motorhome she was in was struck by a transport truck. So those are the 2 scenarios.
Joe, let's talk about UMP insurance. I mean, most people don't know what it is. Could you unpack it for us? What is it? And how does it apply to some of the scenarios we're talking about today?
Jim, it's underinsured motorist protection, and everybody calls it UMP. And it began in the early 1980s when the president of ICBC was involved in an accident. Someone ran into him.
Okay.
And he then thought, what if they don't have enough insurance? What if they badly injure me or members of my family and they don't have enough insurance? Am I out of luck? So ICBC brought in underinsured motorist protection, I think about 1986. And it was everyone got $1 million, and then they changed it and said whatever liability insurance you buy on your car, is the amount of coverage you and your family and your passengers get.
Okay.
And then they reduced it to $2 million, and then they reduced it to one with the ability to buy $2 million. I, through my homeowner policy, have topped my coverage up to $5 million. It covers me, it covers my family, my passengers, if we're hurt in an accident in North America. Mm-hmm. It's $25 a year for the ICBC and a few dollars a year on my homeowners. But it's great coverage because it covers my family. If I go out and spend $1,800 insuring my car, most of that goes to insure people that my car might run into.
Right.
This allows me for a few dollars to insure my family, my family, my passengers. It's great coverage.
And is there more information on topics like this on your website?
Yes.
There is. Excellent. It's Joe Murphy, always insightful. We got lots more to talk about. Joe Murphy at Murphy Battista. You can check out murphybattista.com. 4 offices, including Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. Lots more to talk about, as I said. Here on The Law Show, I'm Jim Gordon. We'll be back in a few moments on BNN Bloomberg 1410.
This is BNN Bloomberg 1410. Now, more of The Law Show with Jim Gordon.
Welcome back to The Law Show on BNN Bloomberg 1410. Jim Gordon here with Joe Murphy, as always, of Murphy Battista. MurphyBattista.com is where you can find out more information on Joe and his firm. 4 offices, Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. Joe, lots of things to talk about still for the rest of the show. We were talking earlier about cyclists and the increased injuries that take place here in the Lower Mainland, Vancouver, and probably everywhere else. Let's talk now about motorcyclists. Again, sun's out. More people are on their motorbikes. We see an increase in motorcycles on the road, of course, and in the last few years, more injuries?
Yes, simply because more people are on motorcycles. 20 years ago, you rarely saw someone over the age of 50 driving a motorcycle.
Very true.
Now, the baby boomers are thinking, I always wanted to have a Harley, and I'm going to go out and buy one.
Yeah.
The problem with Harleys is their technology is from the 50s. It's
really okay.
So they're not the most maneuverable bike out there, and you get people whose reflexes are not what they were when they were 20.
Yeah.
You get motorists that don't notice them, and distracted drivers don't notice them. So there are some, not a lot, more accidents than there used to be. The problem with motorcycles is you have no protection.
Yeah.
I met a fellow who was very badly hurt. He was riding his Harley on a beautiful summer night. The plan was to go around Stanley Park and then back home to Coquitlam, and he stopped downtown at a red light, and he gets rear-ended by a truck, maybe 10, 15 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
But he's on a motorcycle. He's got no protection. He was very badly hurt.
Wow. But has the protection obviously has improved over the years compared to 25 years ago? You're still very vulnerable, I would imagine, but compared to a while back? Your
protection, you got your helmet, which can be really good, a full-face helmet, or really modest. And a friend of mine who's into motorcycling says if you look at the gloves they wear and the boots they wear, it'll tell you how much they know about motorcycling, because real motorcyclists wear heavy-duty gloves and big boots.
Right.
So if you see someone in running shoes or thongs, it means they're really not that knowledgeable. But, horrific injuries. You get amputations, brain injuries because you're so exposed.
Yeah.
And in the summer, people are out and they're going faster on their motorcycle because it's more fun.
Yeah.
There are more accidents and they're more severe in terms of the injuries. Accident the other day shown on TV in Coquitlam, I think, between a big truck and a motorcycle, and the TV helicopter hovering overhead showed this big tarp on the road, which means there was a fatality there. And again, that was on a beautiful summer night, and someone went out to have a fun ride, and it didn't turn out that way for them.
Joe, have some of these campaigns helped in terms of decreasing accidents. We've got Share the Road campaigns. May is Motorcyclist Awareness Month. ICBC's involved. Have you seen, has that helped with awareness, safety?
I think to a small degree. Yeah. But any benefit has been overtaken by the distracted driving epidemic that we're living in the middle of.
Yeah, going back, always goes back to the phone, actually, doesn't people in that in the car we talked about in the first segment. Does ICBC handle these differently, say, between a motorcycle accident and a cyclist accident? Is there any differences?
I don't think so. The cyclist, the liability issues are different because a cyclist has a special status on the road, whereas a motorcyclist is considered a motor vehicle. So there's a little bit different there, but I don't think in terms of that it really makes any difference in how the claim is handled. If you have the injuries are going to be handled essentially the same,
right?
And you get unusual injuries. I did a case years ago of a bride riding from the church to the reception on a motorcycle, and her veil got dragged into the rear wheel, and the motorcycle capsized, and she ended up with pretty significant brain injury.
Oh, my goodness.
From that. So that was one where you say, oh, my God, how did that ever happen?
Wow. And is there differences between how ICBC treats motorcycle and car accidents, for example?
I don't think so. I had one case where I thought the motorcyclist was outrageously at fault, and the adjuster I found out was a motorcycle driver, and he expressed great sorrow that this fellow was stuck with the consequences of his accident. I thought, oh my God, that's amazing. But you get, and it's always interesting if you know the person you're dealing with, whether it's an adjuster or if you go to court, if you know something about the judge, it's a benefit because you get an understanding of where they're coming from.
You have talked to Joe, and we were talking about this in the break. You've been often critical and rightly so of ICBC, but you also you praise them as being on the ball in terms of what they do. For people out there listening, I know they're a punching bag, and I've been one of those people punching often. Can you talk a bit about the changes that occurred this past April? And for listeners out there, I know that we've discussed the way the government was really driving the narrative with dumpster fire comments and things like that. Can you talk about what changed as of this past April and some of the negatives, I think, in terms of brain injuries and costs and everything like that?
Well, what happened, Jim, starting April 1 of this year, the government, it wasn't ICBC, it was the government, changed the system, and what they essentially have done is they've taken what they think are going to be 80% of the injuries suffered in car accidents, the lower 80%, and they've said we're going to label those as minor injuries, even though they're not.
Right.
And we're going to say that these people only have minor, sort of trivial injuries, so we're going to give them a little bit of money for pain and suffering. We're going to limit what they can get for their income loss, and we're going to say to them, you're not allowed to go to court if you disagree with us. It's going to be a clerk in an office who's likely never going to meet you,
right?
Never going to hear you or listen to you, and isn't bound by the rules of evidence. And this is a better system. And I just find it outrageous that the financial problems that exist, and I don't know how bad they are because nobody opens the books.
Yeah.
But they're saying we've got a problem. I know distracted driving is a huge problem, and the government is saying, yeah, this is a problem, so let's turn to the accident victims and say you people have to make good on these problems. An exotic car driven by a new driver hits a pedestrian, and the exotic car is fixed regardless of how much it costs.
Right.
And the pedestrian is told your injuries are minor. We don't give you much, and you don't get to go to court if you disagree with us. Is that really where we're at and who we are? I find it really hard to understand that the government is taking that approach, but especially they're taking away the people's rights to go to court. I've said ICBC is better than dealing with private companies.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I say that having lived in a system where if we couldn't agree on something, we'd go to court and let a judge or jury decide. And the the ability to do that resulted in a lot of cases being settled because ICBC had to admit this is likely what a judge or jury is going to do with it. When you take away that right, and you've got a bureaucrat that says, I don't have to meet you, I don't have to listen to you, and I'm not bound by any rules of evidence. I get to decide whatever I decide.
Right.
And you're stuck with that. And that's the new system.
Yeah.
And that's for 80% of the people injured in accidents. There's no question some people have no injuries in accidents. Some people have minor injuries that clear up within a few days or a few weeks. Those people do well. They're fine. Yeah. But to take these people who have significant injuries and to say we're going to label them as minor and treat them as trivial, that's just wrong.
Well, and circling back what you said last, I think first segment, the people that have brain injuries, how is that measured by these people? In terms of going back to your client that you said you had for like 17, 18 years.
Yeah. See, it depends. If you ask a neurosurgeon to assess someone who's had a brain injury or concussion, they're likely to say, I don't find any residual deficits.
They would say that.
They would say that because on a physical examination in an office, you're not going to pick up things. A neurologist may say that I'm not, on my physical examination of this patient, finding any deficits. But you talk to their family and you say, how are they different? Yeah. Well, he's very irritable and he can't, I send him to the store for 3 or 4 things and he forgets 1 or 2, and he can't watch a movie from start to finish. He gets up and leaves, and he doesn't get along with the family anymore. These are all things that flow from concussions, but you don't determine them by looking at someone in a doctor's office. So under a system like that, they can have a doctor say, I'm not finding anything. The adjudicator behind closed doors says, okay, full recovery, minor trivial injury, next case. And it's almost impossible to appeal that. Right. Almost impossible.
But how long a period do you have before that has to take place? You see a doctor a week after. So week after, 6 months after, it doesn't matter.
They decide. The system decides. Once you're locked into this system of your injury being stamped as trivial minor, you're in the system, and it's almost impossible to get out, and it's almost impossible, totally almost impossible, to appeal it and go before a judge and say they got it all wrong.
Right. Will this change? New government? People complaining?
It's being challenged in the courts. And I think there's a good chance the courts are going to say you can't take away people's rights like that. Mm-hmm. You can't say that of the 100 people injured in car accidents, we're going to take the 80% whose injuries are less severe than the top 20 and say we're going to take away most of your rights and we're going to treat you differently. You just can't do that.
And for the listener out there, and as we mentioned when we started the segment, that the government driving the narrative with the loudest megaphone, explain why, truthfully, the government is doing this. We've heard what they're saying. Is that accurate?
The part of the problem is that about 10 years ago, the then government very quietly changed the law, which had said ICBC runs on a break-even basis. So if they make a little bit of money one year, the premiums the following year are reduced. There was 1 year where checks were sent out, I think, for about $25. Right. And that was the government thinking, if we send them checks, they'll vote for us. So even though it costs more than $25 to send the checks out, we'll send it out and everyone will vote for us. But normally it was adjusted each year. Starting 10 years ago, the government quietly changed the law, and over the following years drew out quietly about $1.6 billion. Right. Through a variety of other ways, I think they drew out another $800 or $900 million. And then when they get to the point saying there's no money in the kitty, they say, well, we've got to change how things are done, as opposed to changing and recognizing that the government has sucked this money out of the system that was to be self-funding. Mm-hmm.
It's Joe Murphy and Murphy Battista. We've got lots more to talk about here on The Law Show, and you're listening to The Law Show on BNN Bloomberg 1410. We'll be right back.
Time now for more of The Law Show with Jim Gordon on BNN Bloomberg 1410.
Welcome back to The Law Show. As always, our guest and expert is Joe Murphy of Murphy Battista. For more information on Joe and the firm, MurphyBattista.com. Offices in Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. Joe, before we took a break, we were talking about ICBC injuries, claims. I got to ask you, because you bring it up often when we talk about it, and that is concussions. Should that be in the category of minor injuries?
Jim, I think it's like saying, should cancer be considered a minor problem or a minor diagnosis? I find it absolutely inexplicable how anyone would think that someone who suffered a concussion has a minor injury. Mm-hmm. I know from experience that if you have a series of concussions, each one of them makes you more vulnerable to the effects of the next. I know people with concussions, you see people with what appears to be modest concussions have devastating effects. You have other people who have significant concussions, and they have a much better outcome. So the idea, there's just no two of them are exactly the same.
Right.
So the idea that you can classify any concussion as trivial, and that's my word, not theirs. They call it minor injury, but that's really what they're saying. This is trivial, so we'll just pay these people a little bit of money and send them down the road. Is outrageous, and I know that the groups who were consulted by the government were told that, listen, concussions aren't going to be part of this because we understand that they're not minor injuries, but it's on the list.
Right.
But it just shows you how broad, and the Attorney General has said is we're trying to capture 80% of the injury claims arising out of car accidents by this scheme.
Right.
So he's included concussions and a variety of other injuries that can be devastating in terms of long-term effect. As I said earlier, someone who has a soft tissue injury, which is the most common, clears up in a few days or a week or two or a month, they're fine. Those people usually don't come looking for any money.
Right.
If I get a phone call by someone who says, I recovered in 4 to 6 weeks, I'll say, okay, you don't need a lawyer. Here's what you do. Deal with the adjuster directly.
Right.
But those people mostly say, I'm fine. Fix my car. They're not looking for, a windfall. But you get some people whose lives are turned upside down by car accidents. And those people are entitled to be dealt with fairly, and you don't deal with them fairly by shuffling them into this system where there's no hearing, the rules of evidence don't apply, there's no opportunity to say, well, this isn't right. I want someone independent like a judge to decide what's fair. That system is gone under this new plan that the government brought in on April Fool's Day of this year.
Ironic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, then, Joe, walk us through then somebody who does come to you, has been in an accident, cyclist, motorcycle, car, with, say, a concussion. We'll stay with that injury for a few minutes. How are things changed for them, and how have things changed for you looking after them since April 1st?
Well, Jim, the key with the ICBC system is for ICBC to get the treating doctor to report early and say this person belongs in the minor injury category, because that allows ICBC to funnel this claim into that system.
Right.
And once you're in that system, you're sort of locked in with no opportunity to say, I don't really belong here.
Yeah.
There is no judge. There's no independent adjudication. It's a clerk who's probably never going to have a hearing, who's not bound by the rules of evidence. So how do they decide what to do? It's just so unfair, and it's so different than the system we've had. And the system we've had has existed with less than 1 in 200 ICBC injury cases going to court.
Right.
Less than 1 in 200.
Yeah.
So the courts aren't full of ICBC injury cases. The fact that you can go to court makes the settlements likely, because if both sides say, if we went to court, the range would be from $20,000 to $30,000, then it's going to settle somewhere in that range.
Well, and I was saying to you in the last segment, though, is that I come to you, I've got a concussion, but you said the window is very small in terms of how long I have to present my case through you, if I'm lucky.
Well,
I mean, how many
once
people...
once ICBC gets the family doctor to say this person... this is the injury, and the ICBC says, aha, this is in that minor injury program, they're locked in, and ICBC has gone to great lengths to try and encourage doctors to report early, and ICBC has actually told the doctors, oh, don't worry about these people, we're going to pay them their full income loss, we're going to pay them all this.
Right.
And if you read the small print in the new system, it restricts it, it limits it.
Okay.
It's like any small print in an insurance policy, it tells you what you're not going to get.
So I come to see you. I've already been to my doctor. Explain the consequences of not seeking professional advice right away from someone like you. I have an accident on Monday. Let's say
Well, the biggest risk, Jim, is that the doctor is going to fill out a report to ICBC, which ICBC now pays double the doctor to do.
Right.
And once that report goes in and they're funneled into the system, it's almost impossible to back out. And I've been working with the doctors of BC saying you've got to really be careful when you fill out these forms, because this has a huge effect on the person. And I'm a little frustrated at not getting a lot of reaction from them, because they say, well, we've been talking to ICBC.
Yeah.
ICBC did consult, or the Attorney General consulted with the doctors a lot before these changes were made. And with each group that they consulted, they got them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which essentially muzzles them.
So you can't see what
well, they won't even tell me if there's a non-disclosure agreement. And they won't show it to me, because that's part of the agreement that they don't do this. So they were really seduced into thinking that, boy, our opinion is valuable, and it's got to be kept secret, even secret from the members, because I've spoken to doctors and they said, I didn't know anything about that.
Wow.
So ICBC was actually quite skillful on how they did this, but the results is a system that's so patently unfair to anyone badly hurt in an accident that's captured by this new system. It's like a kangaroo court, and they don't want to listen to you, they don't want to see you, they'll decide what's fair, and they'll send you a letter. And it takes away people's rights to go to court, which was very seldom used, but the fact it was there allowed them to say, I just want you to be fair with me.
Joe, have you had a recent case where a client or potential client waited too long?
No, it's so new. We're April 1. Most of the time, we don't see people for a couple of months after an accident.
Right.
They wait and see, hoping they'll fully recover, and then they don't need to be bothered with a lawyer. So it's just the early days under that system. But the reality is the doctors have been primed to very quickly report to ICBC, and that's going to take these people and funnel them into this new system.
The way you talk about it, though, and again, sticking with the concussion, if that's what you're diagnosed, I go to see a doctor the week of my accident. Do you see it changing the trend to kind of, I'll be seeing you within a couple of days, because I'm going to need you to get in there and fight for me to fast track it back into another category if I'm diagnosed with a concussion?
Yeah, it's a matter of making sure the doctor understands how significant the information in that initial report is. And I've always said to doctors, when they ask what's the recovery period or anticipated recovery period, that's a standard part of an insurance form, is to just say unknown. Let's wait and see. If they recover quickly, great. If they don't, you haven't committed them to something that an insurance company is going to say, well, it's right here. This is what allows us.
Are you getting reluctant cooperation?
It ranges from doctors who are keen to understand how the new system works and be fair to their patients.
Yeah.
And others that look at the lawyers as enemies. And they've really bought into the government and ICBC saying, we really want to focus more on treatment and rehab. We want to help people.
Yeah.
Jim, treatment and rehab is most effective when it's delivered early on. That's always been the case. So why has it taken ICBC 40 years to discover that there's a benefit to everyone with early treatment and rehab? So when they come out today and say, we want to change our focus, I think that's great. But why now after 40 years? Why not 10 years ago? So I'm suspicious, even though I know they're right.
Yeah.
I'm suspicious what the motive is. And I think the motive was to bring the doctors in to think, yeah, let's deal with the patient. Let's work for the betterment of the patient. And ICBC said, but we have to make some changes on this other side, which wasn't true. They didn't need to do that.
Right.
And that brought the doctors in line, and the doctors have been officially silent about the new program.
So we don't even know, then, not to belabor this point, but we don't. You don't know exactly what the doctors said. They were just asked to consult, and they could have all said no.
The doctors met 8 to 10 times with ICBC and the government before these changes were announced. No one's telling me what was said,
right.
And I can't even get confirmation that there's a non-disclosure agreement.
That's what you said.
So,
well, I'll tell you what. Let's end. You're always educational to our listeners. In the couple minutes we have left, just give us a kind of a step-by-step brief assistance, guidance to our viewers, listeners, I should say, as to what can they do. Walk them through the steps after, unfortunately, they've been in an accident. If
they're injured and if they seek treatment, which is pretty common, the worse the injury, the more likely you are to see a doctor
right
quickly.
Away, yeah.
I think they've got to try and impress on the doctors the importance of being careful in sending these reports into ICBC. Mm-hmm. Doctors are busy, and doctors are skeptical when they're being told be careful, especially when it's coming from the lawyers of that.
Yeah.
But the reality is we just want people who don't belong in that system not to get sucked into it at the beginning, because once they get sucked in, they're probably stuck there forever.
Wow. Sage advice as always, Joe. It's Joe Murphy of Murphy & Battista. If you'd like more information or you'd like to contact Joe, murphybatista.com. 4 offices in BC, Vancouver, Surrey, Kelowna, and Vernon. Joe, as always, thank you. It's always great to talk to you.
You're welcome.
On The Law Show. Thanks for joining us. It's Jim Gordon here. We'll be back again on The Law Show on BNN Bloomberg 1410. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Law Show on BNN Bloomberg 1410, featuring Murphy Battista, LLP, Vancouver personal injury lawyers. If you'd like more information on today's topics, contact the team at murphybatista.com.
It's always best to understand your rights before dealing with any insurance company. If you or someone you know is being seriously injured, the team at Murphy Battista, LLP can help. Book your free consultation at murphybatista.com.